Welcome to the National Centre for Writing's Meet the World event. My name is Patrick Barkham and I am a writer and I live just outside the fine city of Norwich, a UNESCO City of Literature. I'm chairing tonight's event and it's a conversation with three tremendously talented and interesting writers who are each of them based in their own UNESCO City of Literature, and they've been embarking on a really interesting residency, Imagining the City, a virtual residency of Norwich, hosted by the National Centre for Writing. And I'm going to introduce them all, and then they're going to speak and we're going to have a conversation. We're going to hear a little bit about their residency and the writing that they've been doing. So we have Lynn Buckle from Dublin, and Lynn is she's a writer, she's a poet and a painter and an artist and a teacher as well. And so her second novel, What Willow Says, is published next month. And she writes short stories, prose poetry, but also protest writing. And she's very active in the climate writing movement. And so she's been reflecting during her residency on how we can write about the climate within our creative work. Her recent work examines gender, power and place through the lens of fictional nature and climate writing from her own disability perspective. Our second guest tonight is Vahni Capildeo, and Vahni is Trinidad-born, Oxford-educated, academic, poet and writer, now based in Edinburgh, the UNESCO City of Literature of Edinburgh. And she's got a special interest in collaborative and immersive experiments. For example, Skin Can Hold from 2019 offers participatory text for readers to rework. Vahni's 8th book, Like a Tree Walking, is published later on this year, and it reflects their ongoing research into silence. Third guest comes from Reykjavik. It's Valur Gunnarsson, and he grew up on the Viking Trail. He grew up in Reykjavik, Oslo, and in Yorkshire. And he's best known probably for his historical fiction. His first novel was a Viking fantasy, and his third novel was a historic reimagining of reality with the Germans invading Iceland. And his latest book, a brand new book, is non-fiction. It's a travelogue through Russia and the Ukraine, and I think its title translates as Bright Lands. So we'll hear more from Valur about that later on. So first of all, I would like to have a chat with you, Lynn, and perhaps you could tell us about what you've been up to during this virtual residency. How does a virtual residency work for you, and what have you been reflecting upon?
Well, you're right. It is rather different doing a virtual residency rather than actually meeting each other in person. But that's worked quite well for all of us, I think, in different ways for different reasons. And one of the lovely things that we did as part of the residency was to select literature from our own cities of literature and to share those with each other and to promote our own cities around the world. So it's been very interesting looking at all of the 5 of us all together, looking at our choices of books by other authors and reading the work of the other authors and seeing how they work and their different methods of writing. That's always really interesting as a writer, as I'm sure you know, is to talk to other writers about their methods. So we've been meeting up online regularly, and we've all been also assigned projects to do as part of the residency. So we've been giving writers tips, so beginners can follow those on the Instagram page of the National Centre for Writing. I this week, or at some point in time, I was giving a workshop for Lit from the Inside, which is a youth writers group in Norwich. So that was really interesting, giving some ideas and sharing ideas about how we envisage climate writing and how we can put positive solutions to the climate crisis into our fiction. So it doesn't have to be non-fiction, it can be in fiction as well. So we were discovering some of those kind of aspects. And we've all been writing short stories as well as part of the residency and doing lots of research about that. And then one of the strangest things was, for a virtual residency anyway, was to write a walking tour of Norwich. So even though we can't actually walk around the city of Norwich, we've all been researching it from a virtual aspect, and trying to come up with some kind of approach that we could describe the city to another visitor. So for myself, I was looking at signage, and sign language being of interest to me anyway. It became a momentum for my little piece anyway. And so yeah, it's been great actually.
I've read your piece of writing on your virtual tour, and I thought it was brilliant. And I love the idea that you bring up, that actually when you're following Norwich around on Google Street View, for instance, you can't get onto the waterways, can you? There's no sort of equivalent. There's no Google Water View, is there? So you can't see Norwich by travelling along the Wensum. Maybe that's something that Google could fix for us.
I think that would be great if they did, don't you? All the waterways of Ireland and of England and of every city. That's what we need, to send them out on their little boats along the waterways to get that perspective. And that came into my short story, in fact, because I live on the river and the canal. The river in front of my house and the canal is behind, and they both lead to Dublin. I'm on the outskirts of Dublin, on the bogs, on the Bog of Allen, and I envisaged a woman swimming, for some reason, from the tannery where she works to Norwich, in fact, all the way to Norwich, because she can flow along the canals and the rivers to Dublin, out through the sea and around the coast, and end up in Norwich and come back again. So I wrote about this very independent, powerful deaf woman whose life changed.
Oh wow! Can you share some of that with us? Yeah. Lovely.
Yeah, it's called Elba's Tale, and it's spelt in the Irish way, which is Ailbhe. But so that's got to do with eels anyway, because eels form a part of the story. So here's it's just a short extract from the middle of the story, from Elba's Tale. Impregnated she was by eels, they said, her fault for standing in the water. But you, with your curse, are destined to wander alone, they told her. She flowed with the Liffey to Dublin, where all rivers meet, her growing belly swelling. The eels chased her still. A map of Dublin waterways named after women, researched and drawn by bookbinder living on the quays. She found the many streams to be guided around the city using female lines, the spaces in between, the buried rivers and culverts, where she birthed and left her baby swimming, a translucent elver of a thing, left to suck at inlets. Adverse reproductive outcomes associated with maternal exposure to leatherwork include an increased risk of prenatal death, spontaneous preterm delivery, low birth weight, cleft palate, and hearing loss. Garcia and Fletcher, 1998. She stood under dock walls to keep the water in her feet and dipped them into ports. She submerged herself in harbours, swam around piers until she knew the water swell and felt the salty tide pull her out and in. She was forever treading, testing, reading brine until one perfect night when waves flattened out and she swam into the Irish Sea and did not come back. Her strokes lifted phosphorescence from the surface, and Tinshonna shone all about. Like will-o'-the-wisps of dancing light over bog water, they flashed of home. So she kept on swimming, with seaweed in her locks. She swam alongside sailors, past and present, who demanded her presence. They wrapped about her legs and pulled down towards dark fathoms where all things drift, where they mixed with elvers of glass and slipped between her toes. She raced against such tidal currents, among streams of migrating fish. It was no distance at all for the eels, who had come 3,700 miles from Sargasso seas to follow instincts, and she continued on with her breaststrokes. Milling the waves, her arms rotated as blades through wind, and she imagined great farms harnessing wild powers. For rest, she lay on her back, otter-like, and cracked shells with hardened teeth. She swam for so long that she swallowed salted jellied eels and heard their souls a-calling. She could not stop listening, for laments are easily felt through the skin. There were so many choruses near rocky outcrops that she swam about them, taunting the persistent eels. They chased her into the English Channel, which she traversed so quickly, and into northern waters. The accent of water may have changed, but its flavour remained the same. Eventually, they turned into Yarmouth's Yare, a maiden voyager with eels in her hair. So that's a part of her journey. And within that, I've actually combined some of our other residents' writing, because a bit like Vahni, I take bits of writing from other writers or bits from newspapers or from the internet, and I integrate them into a collage to create polyphonic voices in my own writing. So I have some of Liz Breslin's work in there, and I have some of Valur's in there as well. And I think Liz may have repeated the same and used some of mine. So it's a coordinated approach in that piece.
That's a gorgeous piece of writing, Lynn. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It's really interesting. I wrote a poem from the point of view of a polar bear, because every now and again polar bears will come down from Greenland or from the North Pole on ice floes, and then they come when they come ashore, they're very hungry and they're usually shot on sight, which is sort of sad. But yeah, a line from that poem wound up in its piece, which is in a completely different context. So it's interesting to hear.
I love that. I love that concept of sampling, but also that you're both writing about animals as people and people as animals, and and we're both sort of mixing. I think that's a really important, given that we're in the Anthropocene, to be sort of thinking, putting ourselves into the feet and into the travels of other species. Vahni, can I ask you a bit about your residency, because you've been doing some really interesting work and thinking around the kind of concept of the lighthouse and anchorage, and the parallels that you found between your own local place and your local walk during lockdowns, and Julian of Norwich.
Yes, here I am on the north coast of Edinburgh, and there's a decommissioned lighthouse as the main landmark where I am, which is lit up by rainbow LEDs. And it's the place where courting couples or people with their dogs head towards. And during extreme lockdown, there's a kind of very staggered queue, as people here are good at distancing. So there might be 10 meters between each couple, or 10 meters between each dog water, and you'll see a queue of about a mile long, and all people do is walk up to the brave and dainty little lighthouse, look at it for a while, and then walk back. That's our entertainment. And it is nonetheless very heartwarming, and I was first made aware of lighthouses in Edinburgh by the local poet Ken Coburn on a literary walk of Edinburgh, where he took us to the Stevenson family tomb. Robert Louis Stevenson comes from a family of lighthouse engineers, and in fact wrote a poem when he was many oceans away from Scotland, thinking towards those lighthouses. And during this pandemic and the virtual residency, that exercise of the heart, thinking towards a place, I think long predates our current situation. Because it's true in the present, for example, if you have family in the military, or working on cruise ships, or in any state of incarceration, or simply working in fishing. This is or was a fishing port. But I'm also thinking of places of return, yearning and return. So not so much of the pandemic in terms of fixity, but yearning and return. And I found myself very much yearning to return to Norwich, a place I've visited very often since the early 2000s, because of friends, then because I fell in love with the Flints. Julian of Norwich was an anchoress, which meant that she chose fixity of place and lived in a cell attached to a church, you can still visit it. And when I visited it with the poet Tiffany Atkinson, whoever it is now tending the cell had left a little dish of hazelnuts, which reminds us of Julian's vision of everything in creation being a microcosm, no bigger than a hazelnut, all of creation seeming no bigger than a hazelnut compared to the creator, because she was having a vision of the creator of everything there is. And I was thinking of the cell of an anchorage as being a bit like a lighthouse, because people want to return to it, and it seems to beam out a kind of energy. And all I've been doing is taking the same walk to or past the lighthouse along the sea, and thinking towards the rivers, and in Norwich, thinking towards the anchoresses' cell.
And have Julian's words, Vahni, have they helped you see your way or think your way towards Norwich?
Yes, they very much have, not only her words, but also her insistence that her vision is for everyone. That was what struck me very much when I was rereading it, that she is very clear that although she's having these visions, which she had when she was 30 years old, and then spent about the next 20 years editing and re-editing and trying to understand what had been revealed to her, she's clear that although she has had these visions, it doesn't make her better than other people, and that her duty is to translate them so that everyone can share. She doesn't think of herself as an author, even though she is the first English language woman author of whom we know by name. She thinks of herself more as a channel. So that there is already that idea of a text for recirculation.
That's lovely. Vahni, would you like to share with us some of your writing and creative work from the residency?
Here are a couple of journal entries from the walks that I've been taking. February the 3rd, Starbank Park, behind beautiful railings. Enclosure. Wardy Bay looking across to Fife. Exposure. Rupture narratives of our plague time, where we are suddenly at risk or in confinement. Drown out another story. For some, life always has meant enclosure or exposure. How many fishermen are guaranteed a return? How many submarines patrol the waters? How many ships does the sea hold? How many of our ancestors have been in a ship's hold? Perhaps we have the chance to know we're in the same boat. Great Michael Rise, a local street name, commemorates the carrack ordered for King James IV of Scotland for his navy in 1505 and built here. War sends people out, but also hides them. A gap in the seawall looks as if it leads to a stairway. There is a sheer drop and a brilliant view across the Firth of Forth. The gap resembles a mouth. What would the stone say? I remember the stone curves echoing each other in Norwich Cathedral, how they invite, how they recede. I want this cold stone mouth to whisper warm in that stone cold warm air. February 4th. Wind killer of umbrellas, airs losers of love warmth, clear bag of aluminium, litter pickers in digital exaltation, Hawthorne Vale to Victoria Park, border collie belly, mud in the bathtub, lights on in the dreadnought, only being at home allowed. Songs about fish and punishment, songs about fornication and spring. Great Michael Rise to Starbank, breakwater covered by water. White horses have plans, broaching the wall, a shock of manes, nights remembered, indigo bedroll scattered with white jasmine, nights desired, half a glass of crimson wine in a sea blue glass, night moving down the east coast in a shoal of names. My ears are too cold for notes, fingers too cold except for notes, body warm as a stone, body warm 7 times opening stone. Before I read my last sample, I'll just notice a couple of echoes there. And one is that the sharp inlets or streets which lead down to the main street in my village used to be channels for the sea and were on the path where Icelanders would stop off if they ran out of supplies at Shetland or needed to fix their boats. And you can see some of this heritage as well in the word firth, the Firth of Forth, which is essentially the same as fjörður in Icelandic, so the inlet of the sea. And then you'll also notice that the epithets I use in those kind of scrabbly notes for a poem, which is a second journal entry, are influenced by kennings or looking for metaphors which refer to other metaphors, which in Old English poetry can be relatively straightforward, but in skaldic verse, you often get a kind of erasure of metaphor. So you get bits of a metaphor that refer to bits of a metaphor that refer to bits of a metaphor, and you don't really know what the referent is in the end sometimes.
You make it almost sound like Old Norse rhyming slang. You have to know what it's referring to other way, but yeah, it's that are essentially teaching you how to say steed of the sea instead of ship, just to show off, really. Sorry.
Yeah, not at all. But I mean, it can get very, very complicated because you could have another kenning for sea, so it would be steed of the whale road, and then you could have something else on the ship, like a man who would be a warrior, and a warrior would be a tree, and so you have a tree on the steed, and it all becomes quite surreal.
So love that.
So another thing I've been doing is looking at the text of Dame Julian of Norwich's Revelations, going into a trance state, which I hope Valur will explain is something that his werewolf ancestors did with some frequency. And in this trance state, I see certain words erased and other words or word forms emerging from the Middle English text, sometimes by letters within particular words disappearing, and then words being stretched across the line. And these are like flotsam and jetsam of texts emerging. I, it am, 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 I am that joy. Say, receive.
That is beautiful. Sorry, I got to interrupt there because that so reminds me of some of my own artwork as well. The process of erasure, by starting off with say a whole page of words, or with a whole wall full of charcoal, and taking away from that, and what you're left with is very little of the original, but is absolutely exquisite at the end of the day. And that's a bit like, my hearing problems as well. I don't catch everything, and I guess, and what I'm left with is often really beautiful little gems at the end of it. So I wasn't aware of erasure poetry until you read that. So thank you for that. That's amazing.
Thank you for those observations. And I'm also fascinated by what you're saying, because it reminds me of the action of water. Because Caribbean poets like Kamau Brathwaite, with his philosophy of dialectics, and the sea that divides and connects, and the flotsam and jetsam, the currents that endlessly bring and take away. And then later poets like Christian Campbell or the emerging poet Chris Astwood have enabled me to see the edges of water and the movement of water as their own kind of writing. So it's almost like a kind of anti-statuary, it's anti-monumental, that you look at it and think of everything that's been and gone, rather than trying to fix things and make them stay.
Vahni, can I ask a slightly dumb question, which is that the erasure poetry, is that a kind of genre in itself, or is that something that you've devised creatively?
It's a very popular genre, and I'm quite a beginner in it. I learned about it from the Caribbean poet Nicholas Loughlin, who, in his role as a journalist for Citizen Media for Global Voices, travelled all over the world and brought back great knowledge and wisdom. I love his poems, and he's done a lot of word art experiments, and a lot of us in the Caribbean diaspora benefit from the trickle down of this. So Nicholas introduced me to it and showed me the work of the American poet Austin Kleon, who worked with erasing bits of newspapers. I remember loving his Fireflies poem. But then Andre Bagu, who is based in Trinidad, did some really extraordinary erasures based on Walt Whitman, which are my model and what I'd really recommend for people to look at.
So, yeah, but I mean, in a sense, you can use anything as your source material because it's the end result, isn't it? But I guess things can have a double meaning depending on the source material that you're using.
Yeah, very much so. And I think also you can have different approaches. So Andre and I were very involved in traditional masquerade in Trinidad and fascinated by the figure of what's known as the fancy sailor. So all the sailors who've ever landed on the shores of Trinidad are encapsulated in these strange figures who have stylized dances that change over the years and costumes that are many, many feet high. In my last costume, I had wings that were about 10 feet across, and I had to go through doors sideways. So very much a sailor fused with the nature of the place. And I think Andre was doing a kind of queer sailor exploration and looking for erotics of queer sailordom in the poetry of Langston Hughes and more queer erotics in the poetry of Walt Whitman. So as he was erasing texts from them, there would be these amazing narratives of disclosure and desire. Whereas when I look at Julian of Norwich, and obviously I'm in lockdown, I'm looking for the vibrancy of light or love, because she says that the meaning of everything ultimately is love. She very much condemns a worldview driven by sin. And so looking at her text, it's not so much erasing things as trying to make visible the strongest vibrations, freeing those vibrations from the necessity of syntax.
I love that idea, and I love the idea of I can just picture you going into a trance as you're reading Julian of Norwich. That's a lovely thought. Valur, can I ask you about your virtual residency? How has Reykjavik been in the last month for you, and how have you found thinking your way across the water down south towards Norwich?
Well, as for Reykjavik, we are doing better and better COVID-wise. There hasn't been a single case detected for a couple of weeks. So I think we're moving on to the next plague, which is earthquakes. There was on Wednesday, it was one of the most severe earthquakes lately. No one was harmed, but that was sort of, it was a convenient time. It was 10 o'clock in the morning when it was time to get up anyway, but then it kept shaking for a while. And actually on the tallest building in Iceland, at the very top, they were conducting blood pressure research, and everyone's blood pressure shot through the roof. So may have distorted the results a little. Blood pressure researchers get no luck. But back in those in the distant pre-COVID era, there's a strapping young lad going to school in Norwich. I think it was in 2018 to 19. I was doing a PhD in creative and critical writing. Various things happened. The PhDs were certainly no longer eligible for student loans from Iceland, and then I did manage to raise the funds, but then WoW Air collapsed and the Corona went with it, and everything became more expensive. So after the first year, I was hoping to come back to Norwich, and then COVID happened, and So I don't know. When I will come back, I finished the first year. So I don't have the PhD yet, but I do have this nice UEA sweater at least.
Yay!
So yeah, in any case, it's nice to be back to Norwich virtually, if not in the flesh.
And have you been thinking through Max Siebold, who of course with Rings of Saturn kind of produced a very unusual and original travelogue through East Anglia?
Yeah, it's not really connected with anything that I'm doing as such, but one of the things that we were made to do at UEA was doing various exercises where you write Agatha Christie in the style of Dashiell Hammett, or you write George Eliot in the style of John Steinbeck, and it's it's very, you might not use it, but it's a very interesting thing to do because it sort of liberates you from yourself in a way. It forces you to write like someone else, or actually two other people. So I think that's it's great exercises to gain other perspectives on writing, I believe. So this is sort of what I was doing at the residency. Was I don't presume to write like Sebald, but in some sort of dialogue with Sebald. So it's perhaps Sebald doing a virtual walk along the Icelandic coast rather than the Suffolk one.
I like the sound of that. Yeah. Valur, do you want to share with us a little bit about what you've been writing during your residency?
Yeah, so this is more or less the end of it. Day trips out of Reykjavik can span the whole southwestern shore, at the westernmost part of which is the bridge between the continents. In fact, the continental rift between Europe and North America, ever expanding in the age of Trump as it does in all others, runs right through Iceland. But they had to put the bridge somewhere to create that photogenic stroll. As one heads west through the southern lowlands, one goes out of the black and into the green, from the desolate lava fields to one of the few fertile areas that the island has to offer. It was here that Ingólfur, the first settler's man, wanted to settle, and had to look on in consternation as he continued towards what would become Reykjavik. Legend has it that Reykjavik was where his columns had floated to, and hence where the gods had wanted him to remain. More likely, the northern side of the Reykjanes Peninsula offered shelter from the southern winds, nestled safely in Iceland's lower armpit. We are soon back in black, in Reynisfjara, the famed Black Beach. Not a single strip of land stops the waves gathering momentum between here and Antarctica. The reach can be far inland when they finally touch shore, occasionally snatching a tourist with his back turned, dragging him out to sea, selfie stick and all, never to be seen again. Norwich is also a child of the sea, even if it's not visible from the city. It was the nearest port of call for medieval traders from the mainland, closer than London and nearly as big. It was to there that the strangers came from Flemish lands, setting up printing shops and breweries, sometimes both at the same time, thereby mangling the spelling of the soon-to-be world language so thoroughly that it would give Twitter users headaches 500 years later. As befits a book named The Rings of Saturn, by a German wandering through East Anglia, the story ends with a brief history of silk, from Huang Ti to the Nazis. It was the Huguenots who brought it to Norwich and became a new batch of strangers there. I was once a stranger there myself. I am a stranger there no more. Sebald also manages in the final chapter to squeeze in the historical Norwich resident Thomas Brown and his probably ahistorical library. Among the works cited is an account of the travels of Pythias of Marseille in the 4th century BCE, perhaps the first man to circumnavigate Britain as well as reach Iceland. which may or may not be the northern island of Thule. Pythia says that beyond Thule, the air is thick, condensed and jellied, and looks like sea lungs, an unreal place even at a time when much of the world was still unknown. For strangers traveling to Iceland, be they Ingólfur Arnarsson, who did settle, Jörgen Jörgensen, who attempted to, or the various people that come and go these days by air as well as sea, were not grounded by virus or volcano, Iceland seems impossibly distant, a land of wonder, almost unreal. But for those that live there, it is the outside world which inspires awe. In the novel Independent People by Halldór Laxness, an adopted daughter gazes with her farmer father out into the ocean. What is out there, she asks. The father answers, proudly showing off his knowledge. Out there are the countries. Doesn't that sound like a wonderful place to go?
Thank you, Valur. That was wonderful. Can you tell me a bit about your forthcoming book, Brightland, and because that's a kind of non-fiction travelogue, isn't it?
Yeah, it's it's an untranslatable title actually. It's Bjarmalund, which would mean the lands of the rising sun, but today that would have different connotations. But for the Vikings, this was about as far east as you would go or you would know existed. So, and Brightland's sort of fountain of like Bjarmalund. But yeah, I was in Ukraine during COVID, which of course I didn't know was going to happen, and I think they were the only country in Europe to ground all planes, and there were no buses or trains or anything. So I had to make a decision to either stay put, not knowing when or even if I could return, or to take the last plane out. And I decided to stay. And so I wrote the book, which is partly based on my experiences staying in Ukraine last year, and partly based on articles and papers and other things I've written traveling through or living in the former Soviet Union in the past 20 years. Lived in Estonia, briefly in Russia, and I've been to Kazakhstan and Belarus and Georgia and different places. And but it was that old end of the world feeling you get when the forest around Chernobyl is on fire and there's smog everywhere and you can't see out the window, and well, everyone's wearing masks anyway because of the pandemic, and so and you literally haven't seen another human face for 2 months, and it's a good time to write a book.
Yeah, we aren't used to, in the sort of wealthy Western world, the experience of being stranded. How did you find that experience? Did you find it quite stressful, or did it end up being quite a creative situation for you?
It was both. It was stressful actually financially, because I ran out of money and I was getting a bank overdraft, and I was going to go back home in the summer and work that off as a tourist guide, but then there was no more tourism. And so, I had no idea how I would support myself either in Ukraine or in Iceland. But I got a job at the university running a Viking website. So it all turned out well, but it was, and ultimately it was 2 months that I was locked in there without intending to. But of course, you never know how long it would take. People were saying, "Oh, it's going to last until the end of August," or this and that. And then just the day before I left, I went to Chernobyl, which was, I thought, a wonderful ending. I thought Chernobyl would be, the Soviet Union in formaldehyde. All the concrete buildings would be there just as they were left. But it's not. It's disappearing. It's sort of a Soviet Machu Picchu. It's being swallowed again by the forest, and you get the sense of coming back to a world that's been desolate of human beings, and seeing this lost race. And it's almost a bit like the myths and after Ragnarok, where a new race of gods arises, hopefully better than ours after the end of everything on the fields of Iðavellir, or in this case, Chernobyl.
It's a wonderful example of rewilding, isn't it, Chernobyl? Yeah,
and it's amazing that animals, even despite the still existing nuclear race, they're actually doing better. They are stronger and healthier just because they are left in peace. Even so much that they lure poachers again. But
I'd like to read that in translation, but presumably is it published in Icelandic first of all, Valur?
Yeah. I don't know if it will come out in other languages. It's perhaps a longer discussion, but it's sort of a problem that if you are, I can come to Britain and talk about Vikings because I'm coming from the periphery to the center, and I'm supposed to know about Vikings. Maybe Vahni has something to say about this because she also knows a lot, but there's just those different contexts. But being from one periphery, which is Iceland, writing about another periphery, which is Ukraine, and then bringing that to the center, that just, people always ask, so what does this Icelander think he knows about Ukraine, which I actually had with my first novel, which is completely set in Finland and about Finns. So, you sort of, in Iceland, I can talk about wherever because I'm bringing the outside world to Iceland, but going somewhere else, I'm sort of reduced to always talking about Iceland, which I'm happy to do, but it does feel a bit limiting sometimes.
I want to see more writing from one periphery about another periphery. I think we've had too much writing historically from one centre, or the centre looking out to the periphery, or even if it's just the periphery writing about the centre. We've got to have more, haven't we? Certainly in the post-colonial age. I was interested very much in reading, because part of your residency, all three of you have been giving writers tips or writers advice. And Lynn, you mentioned earlier in our conversation here that you were reading the others' writing, and I noticed, Vahni, one of your slew of amazing tips for writers was to read people who are different from yourselves. Have you found the residency interesting and useful to be perhaps reading each other? I don't know how different you are from each other, but have you found that a useful process, Vahni?
Yeah, we are very, very different from each other, though there are also, as I think, remarkable similarities. Valur, you have sent some samples through of straight down the line action fiction prose, which I enjoy reading, but is completely beyond my capacity to write. I was reading that extraordinary excerpt from your novel, which imagines Iceland being occupied by the Germans rather than the British, and is visualizing all the scenes with people picking up different armaments and approaching enclosures in different ways. And then, Lynn, I'm really fascinated by the long novella, the long text that you sent, and the way it shifts between internal and external voices, and what's in people's heads, and then what the landscape speaks. I mean, you literalize the landscape speaking through elements and other living and folkloric beings, and then you also show this in terms of a game of knowledge between generations. I found that incredibly inspiring because those are things that are implicit, I think, in both with Valur and with Lynn, they make explicit what is implicit in my poetry, which is looking at a place and trying to see or sense its depth. So sensing the depth of stories, but also sensing parallel stories, all happening simultaneously. And if you look at places this way, there isn't actually center or periphery. Every place is a sort of kaleidoscope of peripheries constantly colliding.
Yeah, there are so many layers, aren't there? I mean, we have that on a literal level as well, where I live on the bog, you know, so the past, we're walking on it all of the time, and to interweave that into the stories and to use that to help us understand the psychology of the present, I think is well, it's something that I try to do anyway in my own writing. I was really intrigued to know that Vahni, you're working on something to do with silence, because that's very much part of my current piece that you were just reading before, about the silence and the sounds within silence, and you know, the meanings and hearing and all of those sort of things. So what did you mean by silence, and that's what you're looking into at the moment?
I've been trying to write about silence for over 20 years, but I've flitted about between too many jobs and places ever to settle into silence properly. And it actually started off when I was looking at Egil's saga, the saga which deals with Valur's ancestor. And there was a commonplace in English criticism at the time that sagas were unemotional, hard-boiled prose like detective fiction. And although I didn't have the vocabulary for this, because it was a less popular approach in the late 1990s, early 2000s, I noticed that it was in reading the gaps of the narrative and observing the somatic responses of characters that you could notice where emotion occurred. So actions which appeared abrupt, if you were just looking at the conversation in words, were not in fact abrupt. They were very well announced by patterns of silence and by visible changes, you know, someone going as pale as a corpse, or crying tears like hailstones, or deciding to wear a blue-black cloak, or a white cloak, or a red cloak. These are incredibly significant things which did not have to be verbalized in I want to do this, I feel this, how does that make you feel? It'll, you know, don't ask that, you'll be very quickly without your eyes. And
well, that's the symbolism of our cultures, isn't it? If you can read those symbols very easily, which you would do if they're of your own culture, then it's very easy to read all those layers within that story, just like the symbols in a painting.
But yeah, possibly. But I mean, what really interested me was that all of this was not happening in speech, and that when speech did occur, it could occur in the stylized form of a skaldic verse, which contained the kernel and the elaboration of emotion and action. But you don't get the hey this, hey that exchange that you would get in the dialogue of a film, for example. And so I started from that background. I started always reading for silence and always reading for somatic response. And then over the last year or so, I began becoming interested in walks, you know, the walks that able-bodied people have been doing under lockdown to try to keep themselves apparently sane. That I began becoming interested in micro-environments and how silence is not, in fact, an absence of noise or an absence of sound, but a tuning in to particular sounds. So when you can attune yourself to a microenvironment, like the way under a tree, certain sounds will be bounced to you as if they were close, and other sounds will be filtered out. That the way under that tree, you would call it silence, but in fact what that is a complex attunement to a microenvironment of sounds. I spent about all of autumn listening to particular trees, and it would take about 2 weeks to get 250 words out of the trees.
I think you've just described my next book, What Willow Says.
I worry we're all being distilled by Vahni, or distilled into Vahni. You know, she's written about Egil's saga, which is an upcoming novel of mine based on Egil's saga, and then she's also apparently has written Lynn's next book. So yeah. So.
Well, I think that's what you find in a group like us when writers from all around the world are brought together. You find we are very similar. You know, we're all writing about the same things, aren't we? It's a human condition.
And I mean, Lynn, your trees aren't microenvironments of silence, are they? Your trees actually speak.
Well, is it necessary for them to speak? I think that's the question that's being sought within the book, you know, and it's the observations of them, and then the realization that you know, words aren't actually necessary. It's observation that is, and I think that's the key for any writer or artist is the power of observation, really. So whether you get those messages through words or through images, it's how much attention are we paying to each other.
Yeah. Valur, what's the sound of silence like in Reykjavik in Iceland?
I think there's a lot of it, or if not in Reykjavik, then close by. So people come from all over to hear the silence in Iceland, but here we sort of take it for granted. We're not, we want to go to the bright lights of London and New York, Copenhagen. But yeah, I drive half an hour outside of Reykjavik or an hour, you'll be in a place where you probably won't see any people at all, except wind and the occasional bird. And even more so in the Highlands, which is where my last book was partially set. The road's only open 3 months a year, and absolutely no one lives there. It is the whole center of Iceland. People live along the coast. So yeah, if silence is your thing, then there's a lot of it here.
I can just take my hearing aids out. I take my hearing aids out and it's silent.
I love, Vahni, the idea, there's your erasures are a kind of another form of searching for meaning in silence, aren't they? And for meaning in the gaps and the spaces that you create there. Would you describe Like a Tree Walking? Is it poetry? Is it a kind of long prose poem? I don't think you like the word collection, do you, when we describe poetry in shorthand like that?
No, I mean,
to describe your work.
Yeah, I mean, if I've only written one book, which is a collection, which is Venus as a Bear, and in fact, some of that is set in Ireland, and some on Inishbofin, a very small island, and some on a friend's sheep farm just outside Dublin. And that's definitely a collection because it was set up to be a set of poems about things. So sheep would have their poem, and then a particular bay would have its poem, and so on. But the other books I've done tend to have rhythms and themes which unfurl according to different speeds. And with Like a Tree Walking, it starts off inspired by Thomas A. Clarke, the Scottish poet, and his praise of walking. And I do a response which I had originally elaborated with Harry Josephine Giles and Polly Atkin, and that's an unwalking. And I think of bodies which are disabled or queer or bodies of colour, so not the bodies you'd associate with nature writing and the literature of walking, which is, always an invisibilized person with incredibly expensive North Face gear or something. and I go from unwalking into different ways of being in and with place. And some of this is in poetry, some of it is in prose, but all of it is based in real places, although some of them are quite dissolved, so you wouldn't necessarily be able to pinpoint where. So the book itself is really an exploration of unwalking, the literature of walking.
Oh, I love the sound of that. And that's coming out in November, is it?
It is.
Yeah. Excellent. Lynn, we were talking earlier about water and you living in a very low-lying place between two waterways. Are there times, I mean, it's a sort of trite thing to say that we look to water for kind of solace and inspiration, but are there times when it brings terror, when you have a daily relationship with water, it isn't always a friendly one?
Well, we're very close to it. It's literally right outside my house. It's about 20 yards, if that, in front of the window where I'm sitting right now, and behind me is the canal, and where the house is built, the entire estate used to be just marsh and bog, and it was the place where tannery waste was thrown across the river, because nobody could walk here. So it's been built on the floodplain, rather stupidly anyway, and we're in the Bog of Allen, which is one of the biggest bogs in Northern Europe. It is the biggest bog in Northern Europe. So, we should be underwater really anyway. It's been drained over the years. And, I'm sitting here in one of the areas which has been basically exploited and destroyed long before I moved here, in order to fuel power stations. The turf has been dug up on an industrial scale and burnt, and some of it sold, for potting compost as well. That's your Irish moss peat for you. Now that's stopped because of, the 2020 Paris Agreement. So it's being repurposed. So, it's a dangerous time because there's so much water about, but it's a good time as well because there's change happening. So some of the bogs are being re-wetted, some of them have been turned into wind turbine farms, and but there's still always that threat of rising water. Every day when we're walking to school, we're passing the water, and we're making comments on it and how deep is it today, and inventing new signs to describe the depth of the water. In case, I go out, if it's been raining a lot, I go, oh, if I come back, will the house be flooded or not? It's getting close, and climate change is a real reality for us here. So, it kind of features quite a lot. So when I was writing about Norwich as well, and I was discovering all the waters there and the buried waterways, and thinking about that reflooding again. And then I had to think of, I don't know the sign for buried water. It hadn't occurred to me. We don't always use sign at all at home. There's Irish Sign Language and British Sign Language, and then there's home sign, and that's what we really rely on at home. And some of us use lip reading, which I don't. So, it was quite exciting actually, thinking of Norwich and trying to come up with some new signs for the buried water. But the buried, but we got to have this is water. That's a river in Irish Sign Language. So I was trying to come up with but the buried, but with the river running past. Does that make it a culvert? The buried river and outside the cathedral in Norwich, and so yeah, it's created new signs and signages for me anyway.
I was fascinated to learn you mentioned that English Sign Language has a different sign for a river to Irish Sign Language. I imagine Irish Sign Language always being more poetic and expressive, but in your own home sign language, you've got other words for watery things as well, because you've got so much water around you. I guess it's inevitable that we develop multiple words for something when we have an abundance of it, because we see its sort of subtlety and its difference.
Definitely, and that's the richness of language. And even in Osceola, Monica Mahon would be reviving the Irish language and the lost phrases for something like, and that's the title of his book, 32 Words for Field. He's researching the Irish language, Osceola terms for field, and he's come up with 32 of them, which we wouldn't normally use, that we've forgotten about, so he's reviving those. So I'm really keen to include those in my work as well. And then in my work I describe some of the sign language, the home sign language that children are great at inventing that kind of stuff anyway, aren't they? They'll kind of dance around the room, and the musicality that you would hear in your voice is translated into a musicality of a visual musicality and a physical musicality. I mean, there's no coincidence that Sansovino invented the seventh order of architecture out of music. It's all those things are related to music and writing and form and hearing. So even though I might be slightly lacking on one side, we kind of make up for it with other forms of communication.
Would you just share with us a couple of those home signs of water, and because I just feel like I want to see that expressiveness in the visual movement, if you Would you do that, Lynn?
Well, sometimes there's a panic to it, you know. If we see that the river's up here and the rain's coming down, so you know the whole body is involved, and you won't see it going on with your arms in the air, and you know the rain coming down. Now there are official signs for all of those, and I'll give you, whilst you're here, the English sign for river, because I looked it up because I was writing about Norwich. So it's 2 fingers moving away from you in a wavy line. You know, that's a standard. But I did learn British Sign Language. How long ago was that? In the 1980s. You know, that's how long ago I learned the first 2 levels of British Sign Language. And then I was living in Ireland, so I didn't have anyone to practice that with. So I don't know any British Sign Language, I have to say. And most English speaking people, or English signing people, British Sign Language people, aren't aware that Irish Sign Language is different. So yeah, it's all the different colours as well of water, and trying to get those across. And that's a fluid language, you know. We're building upon those as a family, and you know we might not use some that we used 5 years ago because that weather condition hasn't reappeared again. But then you have the still lake, which is frozen, you know. So it's the freezingness and the circular lake. So, but that has a different conditions as well, because it might be a different colour on one day than it is on another day. So all of that can be put into one particular, I won't say hand movement because it's not confined to that. Anyway, that's enough of sign language. Carry on.
No, but it's language, and it's expressing water. And I did want to ask you all, actually, because when I tried to write about the sea, I found it the most difficult thing ever to write about. And I read something like Joseph Conrad and the way he writes about the sea, and it's incredible. And I think it's the mark of a really good writer when they can write one about the sea. Vahni, I loved your phrase earlier about the white horses make plans, I think, in your poetic fragments. What an amazing line that is. How do you find looking out to sea from Edinburgh at New Haven, and do you struggle to find words for it, or do you find it a very sort of stimulating and creative thing to immerse yourself, well, not literally immerse yourself in, but be there in front of?
I've lived or visited the edge of many, many different iterations of the sea, and I would like to note that it is possible to get stranded even in the global north or west, and one of the places I was temporarily stranded was in Iceland when snow drifted over the road, so we could not get back even in the ladder the way we had driven. We had to stay overnight in my friend's farmhouse and then simply wait, and eventually realize the snow wasn't going to drift away. So then we had to take a ferry across a small bit of sea. So that was a very tiny temporary stranding. And that was curious because that was an unseen sea. We stupidly went out for a walk during a blizzard and got lost within about 3 meters of the farmhouse door and sat on a rock, and were aware that the sea was coming in, but we didn't know where we were in relation to the sea. And because of the sensory whiteout of the blizzard, there was no sense whatsoever. There was no smell, there was no sound, there was no look, but we knew that the sea was arriving. So that sea was definitely not white horses. Or if you go to the north coast of Trinidad, to Maracas Bay, where people are eaten by sharks and people eat sharks, it's open to the Atlantic, and there are huge green waves which just roll over very quietly. They're the width of the entire bay. Nobody swims out that far. It's like seeing a hill just turning over very quietly, and doesn't seem to be related to the waves a little bit further in. And the first place I've really seen waves looking like white horses has been here in Scotland, where this winter in particular, there were individual waves with crests, distinct sort of pony-sized waves, so not enormous horses, and not even like horses of the Camargue, but you're thinking of something a bit bigger than a Shetland pony, but each with an individual white crest, but coming with a kind of boiling fury, as if they intended to breach the shore. So, I mean, the sea is so diverse in the way it hits the shore. And when you learn in a book or you learn from your friends or from hearing poetry, all these different epithets for the sea, they don't come alive. You have to visit different seas.
Yeah. Valur, what about you in the sea? Do you struggle to put the sea into words, or does the sea help you?
I didn't necessarily think myself as a particularly nautical writer until we're doing this, and I kind of realized that it's a big part of of my writing. But that's just because you can't avoid it, because there's so much of it here. So in my last book, was the one about the Nazi occupation, Eagle and the Falcon. Danger comes across the sea. That's when the German ships come in and are seen from the harbor. And actually, when the British arrived in May 1940, apparently not everyone in Britain is aware of the fact that Britain actually did occupy Iceland in World War II. But a lot of people at that time were worried that the ships were German. So danger can arrive for sea, but ultimately the characters are saved by going across the sea to Greenland. So for us, definitely the sea is both a danger and salvation. It's where the fish comes from, which sustains us, but it's also taken a lot of people. I mean, there were almost wartime levels of attrition among Icelandic fishermen. Up until over 100 years ago, they would only go out in oar boats, and the weather changes very quickly. So, and obviously they would all be from the same village. So, there were villages where all the men would just have drowned. It wasn't evenly dispersed. And we didn't really go to war, but among most villages here, you can see a memorial to drowned seamen, to the point where it was 9 men to every 10 women in Iceland. That was how many drowned. And up until around 1990, when just the nautical equipment had advanced to the point where it's not really dangerous anymore, but it was. And so maybe, like many Icelanders, I almost think of the sea more as a tool in a way. It's what it brings us, rather than waxing poetical about the waves and the foam. It's more the utility, because the sea is both a wall and a bridge. It separates us from the world, but it's also what can bring us to the world, at least until the invention of airplanes.
I think, well, speaking for myself, maybe, certainly in Britain, a lot of us are very influenced by sort of romantic conceptions of the sea. Who, the romantics were the first to really glory in Britain. I mean, the first to glory in the kind of terror and immensity of the sea, of the ocean, and to see it as a place for solace and self-fulfillment and so forth. But Lynn, how do you see the sea near you? The sea is obviously a big part of the life of Dublin and the history of Dublin.
Yeah, well, there is that threat. But I've been reading a lot of Evan Boland again, the late poet who came from Dublin, and she wrote, in fact, I have it here, A Poet's Dublin. I think you can see that. And that's a wonderful collection on water, really, and how she marvels about the rivers and the seas making the places, that the river is not a woman, she writes, and she writes so beautifully about the women and the womanhood of living in Dublin, and she's been a great influence on me, actually. But I'm just outside of the 5k limit of getting to the seaside where I live. I'm that bit too far inland in the bog, so I'm in the water, but I can't quite get to the sea at the moment because that's more than 5k away. and I do really miss it. I think part of the short story I wrote is my yearning to get back swimming, because I had COVID exactly a year ago at this weekend, and it destroyed my lungs when, I think, was it Valur? You wrote something about seal lungs or sea lungs. I couldn't quite hear it, but I make things up when I can't hear things, and I think you said seal lungs, and that's what mine are like at the moment. I can't get back in the water because my lungs are destroyed still. Even a year later, they're in bits. And I am a real swimmer, and I miss getting into the water. What was it that you said, Valur? Can you remember?
As your inner Celtic coming out, huh? Seal, I want to go back to the water.
Yes.
No, it was actually from, I think you're probably referring to Pythias of Marseille, who said that the air beyond Tula, maybe Iceland, is thick, condensed and jellied and looks like sea lungs. So it's actually saying that this air looks like sea lungs. Right. I don't know if I can quite picture it, but that's, the first known account of the air up around these parts, more or less.
Oh, we have the goddess Boyne from the River Boyne, and she was a seawater goddess. So I want to get back under again. A bit like, everything under, isn't it? Daisy Johnson wrote that, didn't she? She's from your area, isn't she, Patrick? Does she write in that area?
Yes.
Yeah, she's full of canals and watery myths and legends as well.
Round us, the fens in East Anglia have been a great source of really interesting fiction in the last sort of 30, 40 years, really, and a very inspiring landscape for lots of people, but also quite a threatening landscape, and a landscape that probably should be water. Guys, I would love to carry on talking about waterways and sea with you, but I think we've exceeded our allotted hour. I just wanted to finish by asking, forgive me, a slightly terrible question, slightly journalistic question, which is, I wondered if each of you might have a go at summing up your virtual residency in Norwich in 3 words. How would you describe it? What 3 words spring to your mind? Who wants to go first?
Well, it's been inspiring, collective, and watery. Lovely,
Lynn, thank you. Vahni?
Werewolfish, multipolar, and oceanic. That's not very nice, is it? I could just say it's loving, fishy, and stony.
I love that. I love that you've given us 6 and they're all brilliant. That's just excellent, Vahni. Valur, how about you?
I think I would go with seeing writers' faces, because one thing that COVID hasn't taken away from us is books. We've actually been able to read, and and book sales are up, at least here, and so on. But actually, and we're sort of reduced to our closest friends, in times like this. But actually, talking to writers is more interesting by now than reading their work, which we already had. So this is a unique opportunity to do that.
Well, it's certainly been absolutely fascinating for me talking and listening to you 3 tonight. So Lynn, Vahni and Valur, thank you so much for your time and your conversation. And I feel hugely stimulated. I'm sure any of you watching feels hugely stimulated too. And if you've enjoyed this Meet the World conversation, then please go to the Imagining the City section of the National Centre for Writing's website, and you'll find more of these writers' writings, but also more spoken events like this one. Thank you very much, all 3 of you. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening.